Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the National Air and Space Museum. Hello, I'm Roger Lanius, Associate Director for Collections and Curatorial Affairs here at the Smithsonian Institution's National Air and Space Museum. On behalf of General Jack Daly, I would like to welcome you to the museum. General Daly is our director, who could not be here today. To this afternoon's program, Star Trek's Continuing Relevance. During the nearly 50 years since the show first aired in the 1960s, it has been a powerful voice in popular culture, literally worldwide. The museum has several items associated with the show, most especially, and if you've not seen it, I would urge you to go, the original Enterprise, which is on display in the bottom floor of the museum shop. We are pleased to present this program today on this continuing relevance of Star Trek. We have four esteemed speakers. The first is my colleague, curator Margaret Weitekamp, who will provide something of a historical perspective on this issue. Margaret's in charge of our popular culture collection. She's responsible for tribbles and other assorted things associated with Star Trek, as well as lots of other stuff. Next, Dan Hendrickson, who is Director of Civil and Commercial Space Systems at the Aerospace Industries Association, will speak to us about some citizen efforts to try to pursue science and technology and its relationship to Star Trek. Third, Nancy Reagin, who teaches modern European history and gender studies at Pace University in New York, will speak to us. She is the editor of a book called Star Trek and History. She has firm ideas about how the holodeck and other technologies could be used to teach history, especially in Starfleet Academy. And finally, Mike Gold, who serves as Bigelow Aerospace's Director of DC Operations. He's got many responsibilities associated with Bigelow, most especially dealing with such things as export control. He has lots of stories. Some of them are entertaining. Many of them are frustrating. But that's not why he is here today. He's going to talk about possibilities associated with Star Trek and preservation. So finally, thank you all for coming. I'm going to turn the podium over to Margaret, who is going to carry on with this particular program. Thank you much.
Thank you very much, Roger. As Roger said, my name is Margaret Weitekamp. I'm a curator here in the Space History Division at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. I work with what we call our social and cultural dimensions of spaceflight collection, which means really our collection of spaceflight memorabilia of the actual space program, and then also all of our memorabilia and toys and other things from space science fiction, those imagined visions of what it could be like or would be like to travel into space. And so the question that I'm posing today, why does the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum have Star Trek objects in the National Collection? In some ways, it's really the same question that one might ask of a kind of a presentation like this. Why Star Trek in the Museum of National Air and Actual Spaceflight? And I will give you my answer right up front, which is that initially, when this museum was first created, this was really, Star Trek was seen as relevant as a current event, as a popular culture aspect of the museum's core interest in preserving the material history of actual spaceflight. But I would argue that it is, in fact, even more relevant today because the insights of new scholarship in the humanities and in popular culture really allow for new and more complex understandings of this relationship between what is imagined, what is envisioned, and what is actually done. And really, in many ways, that is really what we are trying to bring to you today, is to bring to you the insights of some of this new popular culture historical scholarship. And also then we have two wonderful speakers here to talk about the relevance of this imagined vision of spaceflight for what they are actually doing in the current aerospace industry. And so as Roger mentioned, the museum has in its collection, and here's a picture of it down in the gift shop. Has anybody been down to see the original studio model of the Star Trek Enterprise? If you haven't, you should head down. It's in the basement of the gift shop downstairs. But this is actually an object that was in the National Air and Space Museum's collection before the museum even had this building. This is the original studio model, 11 feet long, of the Star Trek Starship Enterprise. This was created for the original television show, which aired from 1966 to 1969. And for those of you who are young enough not to know this, this is because back in the day, before computer-generated imaging, if you wanted to have a spaceship in your television show or in your movie, you had to build one and then film it. There was no drawing it in with the computer afterward. What they were able to do was basically shoot this in front of a blue screen and then put the star fields in behind it or put the orbiting planet in behind it. But this was put together for the Star Trek television show, which aired for 3 seasons. And then it was given by Paramount to the Smithsonian Institution in 1974. So that was 2 years before this building was even opened. And it was really a gift for the museum was putting together a Life in the Universe exhibit. That was originally, this museum existed before the building was opened in the Arts and Industries building, first as the National Air Museum and then later as the National Air and Space Museum. And the curators who were putting together this Life in the Universe exhibit in the early 1970s thought that this would be a wonderful way to give some vision of what people have imagined future spaceflight might look like. And in some ways, Paramount gave it. They didn't lend it. They actually handed it over to the National Air and Space Museum in 1974 because they didn't think it was that big a deal. It was a prop left over from a failed, canceled 3-season television series. There had been no conventions. There were none of the other 5 television series had been envisioned. No one envisioned 12 major motion pictures. No one envisioned conventions and merchandising and the Klingon Language Institute. Nobody envisioned the universe that is Trek, and so they gave this to the National Air and Space Museum. And in fact, when it showed up, this is one of 2 Polaroids we have. We only have 2 intake pictures. This is what it looked like. So you'll see that what we have there is the main hull and one of the nacelles packed into a plywood box. It's kind of dirty. I'll draw your attention to the fact that we're looking at the port side of the vehicle, which is important because you'll see that all of the wiring that they used for the lights when they were actually filming this ran out the side of the vehicle and was just basically taped on. And because almost every shot that you've ever seen of the Star Trek Starship Enterprise from the original series showed only the starboard side. It always zooms across the screen with that side facing you. It always orbited the planet with that side facing you. They didn't need that much decoration on this side, and it was one of the ways to hide the wiring that they needed in order to run the lights and the special effects that were a part of this. So it's something that was then cleaned up and put into the display at the National Air and Space Museum, and eventually came, after its first exhibit in Arts and Industries, to this building where you're sitting on the National Mall. This is a contemporary picture of the museum, and it really came into place there. And if you came in the early years, you might have seen it. This is it hanging actually in this room, when this room was the rockets exhibit. And you'll notice that it was hung. So I'm curious about our visitors. Did any of you ever see the Enterprise here hung? All right, I know we've got at least a couple over here. Yep, thank you. Did anyone come to the museum and get to see there was a Star Trek show that was here for about a year in 1992? Okay. The man in the Star Trek shirt in the back. This is something, we had it on display and it was hanging. It is now, you'll notice, being supported standing. It was not designed to hang. And although the museum hung it for years, after doing some x-ray work, we looked at it, and my predecessors noticed that there were some stress fractures in the wood. It's actually not made of plastic or fiberglass. It is, in fact, almost entirely wood and paint with some plastic and metal. And so we now have it on display, and it is mounted. But in many ways, it is now included in what we call the social and cultural dimensions of spaceflight collection. And this gives you some small sampling of the kinds of things that tell us that broader social story of who are the people that made spaceflight happen, and what is the culture that has produced both actual spaceflight and imaginations about spaceflight. And so we have everything from, in the top left, precious metal medallion with gems that was created for John Glenn for his 1962 orbital flight, and one was given to his wife Annie Glenn, and one is in our collection. To below that, a kind of very everyday piece of memorabilia, a mission patch. Does anyone in this room own a mission patch? If you've been to a space site, it's a very common piece of memorabilia. This one is from Eileen Collins' first mission as the commander of a space shuttle. We have things like box model kits. Has anyone built a boxed model kit? I see some nodding. Okay, we keep those actually less for the little plastic pieces on the little plastic trees inside the box, and as much for the artist's vision that we have on the cover of this Revell box for a Mercury kit, which gives us a vision that no person would have had at the time of what it would look like to have a Mercury capsule separating from its booster. But then we also have kind of everyday memorabilia of significant space achievements and very unusual pieces. In the middle there, you'll see on the left, we have a medallion that was minted for commemorating Apollo 11, showing Neil Armstrong, Mike Collins, and Buzz Aldrin. And then immediately to its right, a slightly more unusual way of commemorating Apollo 11. That is a lady's handbag in the shape of the Command and Service Module, made and given to the wives of the astronauts. But then we also have our space science fiction collection, which is very much, I think, even made more meaningful when we put it in this broader context. Things from Star Trek, as you'll see, a credit card on the top, some stickers from Star Wars, but we have things going back as far as trading cards from Buck Rogers from the 1930s, and up to, again, trading cards and memorabilia from Babylon 5 in the 1990s. In amongst them, we have these. Does anyone know what we're looking at? Yes, very much so. And so as we think about going out into the universe, we think about what would alien life look like, and often that is less about literally what aliens might we find, and more about our kind of visions of who is the other, who is alien, who is different from us, and it gives us a popular culture vision of that. And we have a special treat today. We were actually able to bring a tribble out, and if my able assistant, Marcy Borger of our collections department, is making her way around, gloved with we have 5 tribbles in the collection, and we've brought one out and fluffed it up a little bit for you. And this is an original tribble from the original Troubles with Tribbles Star Trek episode from 1967. 3 were given to the museum, and then the museum had to make the kind of embarrassing phone call back to Paramount at some point and say we had gone back through the collections. This is before my time, I will note, and we only had 1. They could only find 1. And so, in fact, instead of multiplying, ours had reduced to 1. So now they sent us some more, and now we have 5 tribbles in our collection. So we have everyday objects, but we also have these kind of one-of-a-kind television props. And so when you go to visit it, I hope that you'll notice when you look at the Star Trek Starship Enterprise that we have 2 labels. My predecessor wrote 2 labels for it, one for the studio model and one for the Enterprise, which is, I think, existing most in our heads, in that vision that we remember from watching it on a little glowy cathode ray tube back in the day. But really, when we were first collecting these objects, we were thinking about them in terms of their position as examples of a fictional starship. But now we really are thinking about them in terms of their broader significance. So when I talk about Star Trek, I'm talking about it both as a cultural phenomenon, but also as an agent of social change. And I'll end with one story about Gene Roddenberry's vision, as you'll see, included a mixed-sex, racially integrated, multinational spaceship crew in 1966 and 1967. And that had tremendous impact culturally, more so even than many people realized at the time. And so actually, a year or so ago, I got a chance to talk to Nichelle Nichols, who is the actress who played Lieutenant Uhura in the original series, and she was able to tell me the story, which she's told other people at other times, but I was able to put it then in Nancy's book, Star Trek in History, about how she actually, as an artist, as a singer, was starting to feel like her talents were not well used on Star Trek, that she didn't have many lines, she didn't often go with the away crew, and so she had decided that she was going to quit the program. And she went to, as she tells the story, she went to a fundraiser for the NAACP, and she was told that there was someone there who was a fan of hers and would she be interested in meeting him. And when she turned around, it was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And he talked to her about the fact that Star Trek was one of the programs that he and Coretta Scott King really felt very comfortable letting their kids watch, because it was a vision of successful racial integration, of a racially integrated cast working successfully in the future, working together and working as equals. And so she decided to stay on the program, and it really was something that many people noticed. Whoopi Goldberg has told the story that she asked for the role of Guinan in Star Trek The Next Generation because when she was a kid and she was watching Star Trek, it was the first version that she got that black people made it to the future. If you watched most 1950s science fiction, it was entirely white, and she was so excited to see an African-American woman not as a maid, but really as a part of the command crew. And so I'll end with the picture that ended up in the book. Now, she took that same picture with Barack Obama that same week, and he looks so much cooler than I do doing. But Henry Jenkins, who is a really prominent scholar of popular culture as a serious academic study, has coined the term ACAFAN, so ACA-FAN. And he says it's because so many people doing popular culture studies are part academics and part fans. And really both sides of that feed their enthusiasm for the subject. And this is sadly just a picture of my complete nerding out. But in many ways, that idea is really what we're trying to bring to you today, this idea of an ACAFAN, part academic, part fan, showcasing both our fandom and also bringing you then some new insights from scholarship and from the aerospace industry. And so I hope that you'll help me welcome our next speaker, Dan Hendrickson from the Aerospace Industries Association. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for coming out. Thank you very much to the Smithsonian Institution, to Margaret, and to Dr. Lanius. Thank you also to the museum. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be on stage with such a distinguished group of speakers today. As mentioned, my name is Dan Hendrickson. I'm with the Aerospace Industries Association. We're a group of about 350 aerospace companies. Actually, one of our co-founders was Orville Wright, so there's a lot of really great history that is embedded in our organization. I get the chance to work with our space companies directly, which is, as you might imagine, pretty exciting if you've walked around the museum here today. It's a really cool day job to be working with those companies on a day-to-day basis. And although it is exciting, we did notice that there was a little bit of an alarming trend that we were noticing. We noticed in the public there was a little bit of a misconception, perhaps also in the media, that with the space shuttle program coming to an end, that human spaceflight was over, that we were finished, we weren't going to be doing that anymore, let's move on to something else. And it's kind of a disturbing thing to see because it's not true. It's actually quite the opposite. We actually have more activity happening right now, more vehicles being built right now than at any one point in the rest of our history. And so as encouraging as that is, it's disturbing to think that there was a misconception out there, and we were worried that our students, our young people, might have the misperception that there's no future in space, that we don't have an exploration future, which of course is not true. As we were kind of thinking about that and kind of letting that marinate in the back of our minds, we realized that Star Trek was coming out, the sequel to the smash hit that we all remember, and that Star Trek Into Darkness was coming. And we thought, you know, there might be a really novel way of syncing the excitement of actual space exploration with the legend and the amazing franchise that is Star Trek. And so we kind of brainstormed a little bit, thought about how can we bring those two together. And, you know, again, it really makes a lot of sense to bring Star Trek and to space exploration together as much as possible. And that's because as you kind of think about warp drive, for example, in Star Trek, we don't have warp drive today. We don't have that capability. We have a long way to go before we develop it. But the imagination, the ingenuity, the innovation that's going to be required to build that is alive and well in space exploration today. The Voyager mission, for example, it's leaving the solar system. It's the first human-made object to leave our solar system. That's truly tremendous. We are boldly going where no one has ever gone before. The Kepler Space Telescope, you might have seen some news about its primary mission ending. The reason that made such big news is that it's made so many great discoveries. It's actually discovered hundreds of new planets outside of our own solar system. Again, we're seeking out new worlds. And astronauts, they're living continuously on the International Space Station for onwards 13 years now, 12 full complete years. We have never left the International Space Station uninhabited. It's continuously inhabited. It's a permanent human presence. So as you think about that, as an interesting side note, the original Enterprise was actually supposed to only last 5 years, and our own International Space Station is alive and well and going on to its 13th year and to many more years to come. So we're not doing so bad. So as we thought about these things and we realized there's such a great synergy, we realized that we wanted to take this great feeling about how we're collectively making our first steps toward an actual Star Trek future, and decided we would actually place an ad for space exploration as a movie trailer upcoming in the Star Trek Into Darkness movie. So as you go to the theaters and you see an ad for Mountain Dew or for Toyota Camrys, we wanted to have an inspirational message to our young people to know that our future is bright in exploration. Now, because we were reaching out to our young people, we decided it would be great to partner with an organization that was pretty much invented the inspiring programs to reach out to school children with space education. And so we reached out to an organization, nonprofit known as Challenger Center, and they do really great work. They reach out to at least 400,000 students every year and provide space education to them, show them how and why we do what we do when we study math, science, engineering, because it leads to these exciting things. It lets us do these exciting things in space and in Star Trek. And so we reached out to them. We partnered with that organization. They actually put on simulated missions for school kids around the world, and that's how they embrace and understand why math and science matters. And so it was a natural fit to work with them in reaching out to students. They actually offer an opportunity for students to figure out, what is it actually like to be Dr. McCoy? What is it like to be Geordi LaForge on Star Trek Next Generation and be the engineer working on engines? So with that partnership in place, we decided it was time to identify a video. What would we actually put in the movie theater, and what would we play? And thankfully, NASA had already put together a really great video that shows where we've been, where we are now, and where we're going in space exploration. And we realized this would be the perfect basis for our ad. So I'll go ahead and play that video.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
We are the explorers. We have a need to find what is out there. It is a drive inside each and every one of us. The drive to wonder, to push the boundaries, and to explore. We expanded across our lands, settling new frontiers. We took to the oceans and learned that we could cross treacherous expanses in the pursuit of discovery. And then we took to the skies and flew. But that wasn't enough. We left the planet and redefined what was possible. We flew in space. We walked in space. What once was a melodramatic flight of fantasy became reality. Then, a new generation of spaceships captured hearts and minds for 3 decades and helped build a castle in the sky that is our lasting home in space. We have always looked up. For centuries, we wondered what was on the other side of the sky, and we have begun to answer that question. We have learned that all the exploration humankind has achieved is only a beginning. Right now, men and women are working on the next steps to go farther than we have ever gone before. New vessels will carry us, and new destinations await us. Everything we have ever accomplished leads to this moment in time, where exploration will now take us to the planets and the stars. Our nearest neighbors in the night sky have beckoned us, invited us, dared us to reach for them. We are the explorers. Throughout our history, we have taken both small steps and giant leaps in that pursuit. Our next destination awaits. We don't know what new discoveries lie ahead, but this is the very reason we must go.
The voice you may recognize is actually Mr. Peter Cullen, who is the voice of Optimus Prime from the Transformer movies. And so that sealed the deal for us. We knew when we heard that voice, this is what belongs in theaters. So we decided after picking the video that we would add one more twist, and that is that we would crowdfund the effort. Now, if you're not familiar with crowdfunding, that's an instrument that's used on the internet in which you can raise funds for a product or a cause that you feel strongly about and ask the general public to contribute. Originally, we had intended to raise $33,000, and we would put this trailer in 4 cities across the United States: Washington, New York, Chicago, LA. And after actually doing the campaign, we ended up with $52,000, and we're now going to increase the geographic footprint of this effort to 50 cities across the United States. Coast to coast, even Alaska and Hawaii will be included. When all was said and done, we had 1,700 donors, and we had an average donation of about $30. So it was really a grassroots effort, and we're really proud of the statement of seeing so many people in the general public stand up and say that they want to take ownership of the space program and space exploration. And so, of course, the funding is really great, but it wasn't really about the funding. We did the crowdfunding campaign just to have that statement of support. Now, the original video you saw was a bit long. It's about 2 minutes, 30 seconds. And so that had to be edited down and put into a 30-second ad spot that would fit in a movie theater, which is no easy order, as you saw, because there's a lot of content. But we think we've done a pretty good job of editing that down and still maintaining the story that's there. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and do the public premiere of our trailer. It will be playing starting tomorrow, Friday the 17th, as I mentioned, in 50 cities across the United States.
We are the explorers. Throughout our history, we have taken both small steps and giant leaps in that pursuit. Right now, men and women are working on the next steps to go farther than we have ever gone before. We don't know what new discoveries lie ahead, but this is the very reason we must go.
Coming to a theater near you. Visit adsforspace.com to see where the closest city is where it's playing. Thank you very much, and remember, live long and prosper.
Well, I'm sorry to have to drag you back into the past after that. It's so forward-looking. But I want to thank Margaret and the Air and Space Museum for inviting me this afternoon. I'm Professor Nancy Reagin of Pace University in New York. And as Margaret mentioned, I published a collection recently of essays about Star Trek and history, and Margaret wrote the essay about Uhura and race and gender in the 1960s. I wanted to talk today a little bit about the uses of history in Star Trek, because for a franchise that is about the future, it really is extremely concerned with the past and revisits the past frequently. History is full of shiny bits and building blocks, compelling people or well-known characters and events, and all creators of imagined worlds, even worlds set in the future like Star Trek, often draw on these bits and pieces from history to make their own imagined worlds. So whether you're talking about Star Trek, Star Wars, Harry Potter, or any other immensely successful exercise in world building, all of these imagined worlds use material from historical cultures to flesh out their own universes. Let's see. Can we get the PowerPoint to work? Oh, yeah, there it is. So there are too many examples of the way that Star Trek uses history for me to fit into a short talk today, but I'm going to touch on some of them. And I want to talk also about the ways in which each Star Trek series was a product of its own decade, because in very specific ways, the plots and backdrops that you see in many of the series episodes or films reflect the concerns or the social movements of the time in which they were made. So first of all, real historical cultures or backdrops are often used in Star Trek to develop alien cultures that have parallels with real Earth historical cultures. So in these examples, the Star Trek scriptwriters and producers are using historical cultures as a kind of quick shorthand for the audience. They are deploying images like swastikas or Chicago gangsters or Roman gladiators to quickly set up scenarios for their stories that involve racial hierarchies or the internal politics of organized crime, or the exercise of imperial power. So, for example, you see a depiction of a culture remarkably similar to Nazi Germany in the original series episode Patterns of Force, or 1920s Chicago in the episode Piece of the Action, and a modern version of Imperial Rome in the episode Bread and Circuses. Cultures or objects from our own history are also sometimes used in passing, sort of just to sketch in a really quick back history for other societies or peoples that the crew of the Enterprise encounters. So, for example, there's an episode where Kirk and Spock and McCoy arrive to try to rescue all the people on a planet because its star is going to go nova, called All Our Yesterdays. And they are sent into the planet's past to escape the nova, which is where all the other modern inhabitants of the planet had fled. And Spock and McCoy are thrown back to its ice age, where they meet the lovely political refugee Zarabeth. But other periods of the planet's past that are visited seem remarkably similar to Earth. For example, Kirk is thrown back to a place that looks just exactly like 17th century London, complete to cavaliers with their hats. Another recycling of Earth historical culture is seen with Miramani's people in the Paradise Syndrome. In fact, for a historian, this episode is rather unpersuasive because they seem to be trapped in historical stasis. We're told that these people were brought from Earth, Native American cultures, and they've been living there for hundreds of years, but they seem frozen in time. They have not developed any new technology or any changes in their society whatsoever in all the time they've been there. But bits and pieces from other real historical cultures sort of are sprinkled throughout many of the other episodes and films. For example, in the backdrop of the episode Requiem for Methuselah, and also the Squire of Gothos episode, where the characters that they encounter live in castles or palaces that are full of 18th and 17th century furnishings. Historical narratives and settings are sometimes used in Star Trek to set up plots that revolve around what I would call historical tourism. That involves sort of recreated history for pleasure or amusement or educational purposes. The holodeck is a huge help for the Enterprise crew in playing with history in this fashion. So the appeal of the holodeck as a site for recreating or playing with history is really obvious. I can only imagine what people who do historical reenactment today could do if they had a holodeck. And of course, the people in the Enterprise are alive to it also. So we see Star Trek Next Generation characters using the Enterprise holodeck to visit the American Wild West or San Francisco during the 1940s in The Big Goodbye, or Victorian England, or they reenact Raymond Chandler type detective dramas or Arthur Conan Doyle stories. You also see historical tourism in the original series episode Shore Leave, because there's just interesting bits and pieces of historical cultures or fantasies that people can sort of summon at will in this episode. So each character encounters historical objects that he or she imagined, which can produce a kind of dizzying pop culture historical effect, with a knight on armor and a horse, or a samurai appearing suddenly for Sulu, or a woman who clearly has a thing for Disney princesses, suddenly summons for herself a kind of well, the headdress is medieval. I don't know about the dress. Anyway, but she's having fun with it. In other episodes, such as the original series episode Savage Curtain or Spectre of the Gun, historical backdrops or characters are recreated not for fun at all, or certainly not for the fun of the crew of the Enterprise, but rather for the amusement or the edification of the aliens that they have encountered. So they're sort of put on trial, and the aliens use our own history to try the crew. So you get historical characters like Abraham Lincoln or the Vulcan philosopher Surak are used to explore ethical dilemmas and also to test Kirk and his friends. Real history is often at the heart of Star Trek episodes and movies that revolve around time travel. And that is a frequent focal point for all of the Trek series and several of the films. So the original Enterprise crew visits places in the past in episodes like the classic City on the Edge of Forever or Assignment Earth, and of course in the fifth movie, The Voyage Home, where they come back to contemporary San Francisco. Preserving the timeline is always a problem for Star Trek's storylines. In theory, the characters are not supposed to change the past because for our real history carries a kind of authority and legitimacy for the characters, but also for us, the audience. We really don't want to see our own place in time destroyed. And in Star Trek Voyager series, we even learned that there's such a thing as a temporal prime directive, which forbids interference with historical events and requires maintenance of the timeline. And nonetheless, Kirk and the other characters often cannot resist monkeying around with the timeline. And in fact, Starfleet even forms a department of temporal investigations to try to police the timeline. And we're told that of all of the people in the Federation's history, Kirk has the thickest folder with this timeline police because he seems to intervene so often. Usually they do fix the timeline, which as a historian, I'm happy to see history preserved. Although the 2009 movie was the first was one of the first I can remember where they don't end up fixing the timeline in the end. They let the change stand. Now, real historical developments are often also reflected in Star Trek episodes and films in the sense that each of these films and TV shows is a product of its own time. It's what Margaret was calling a cultural phenomenon, that derives from spaceflight. And the plots and the assumptions you see in each series usually reflects the political and social and the material cultural aspects of the period in which it was made. So an episode that does that very obviously is the original series episode of Private Little War. It plays out on a planet that is a proxy site for a proxy war between the Federation and the Klingons. And the Klingons, of course, are usually cast as crypto-Soviets in the 1960s series. And it resembles many of the kind of outsourced conflicts that the US and Soviet Union engaged in during the Cold War. And the episode features Kirk offering an explanation to McCoy of why the Federation should back one side on the planet Neural, and it's completely summarized the then current US rationale for involvement in Vietnam. And yet, the original series itself reflected changing attitudes towards the Vietnam War, because by the end of the series, you have an episode like the Omega Glory, where clearly they're taking a much more distance and negative view of these kinds of proxy conflicts. Let that be your last battlefield is a comment on the pointlessness of racism, although it also, to me, borrows a plot line from Les Mis. And the hilariously awful, this is my vote for worst episode ever, Way to Eden features a group of, is a rather cliche view of hippies and flower children from the 1960s. Now, later Star Trek movies and series also reflect the social movements of their decades. So there's a change over time here. And you see the shift, for example, in the attitude towards the environment and species preservation. The very first episode of Star Trek, the original series ever broadcast, was The Man Trap, which featured a creature who was the last of her species and yet who must be killed in order to save the human characters. But in later years, Star Trek showcases a notable concern for the environment and endangered species, which is the whole point of the fifth movie, The Voyage Home, which is about saving the humpback whale. And so here you see Spock diving into a tank to mind meld with one of the humpback whales so he can persuade this creature to come back to the future with him. And towards the end of the show, you see the Klingon ship that Kirk and his crew hijacked intervening in front of a whaling ship, and it's very reminiscent of the way that Greenpeace, an organization in the period when this was made, used to send in little boats to get between the whaling ships and the whales. But species extinction and survival also feature in several other next-gen episodes, such as the episode New Ground, which revolved around transplanting and reestablishing a species on a new planet. And the sixth Star Trek movie, The Undiscovered Country, is also concerned with the threat posed by environmental degradation, because it starts off when the destruction of a Klingon moon leads to the loss of the ozone layer around the Klingon homeworld. And of course, the ozone layer around the Earth was very much a concern in the US by 1990 when that movie was made. The most recent series, Enterprise, is very much a product of the post-9/11 world. The season finale of the second episode, The Expanse, features a surprise attack by the Xindi, an alien species, which destroys an area ranging from Florida to South America, killing 7 million people. Much of the third season of this show revolved around the pursuit of these terrorists, and that made up a story arc about the temporal Cold War. It is possible that terrorism will be a concern in the next Star Trek movie as well. So each Star Trek series and film reflects the period in which it was made. And by showcasing real historical cultures, Star Trek helps to shape popular understandings about how the past truly was. And finally, I wanted to talk very briefly about how the series sometimes foreshadowed the future, that is to say, our present. Gene Roddenberry was a futurist, and the first series tried to make projections or show depictions of where they thought technology was going. So in the original series, we see the first depictions on screen of a Bluetooth-type headset, and I've got a shot of Uhura wearing it there in one. And also the first depiction of multi-touch tablets, which she has in front of her in the next picture. You see Spock using floppy disks for computers, and I would argue the communicator is really the first cell phone. It even looks like the very first little clamshell cell phone that I had. So Star Trek really, for me, covers all the bases chronologically. When it covers past, present, and future. And I think that's one reason why its universe is endlessly fascinating for many of us and has a continuing relevance. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mike Gold. I'm with Bigelow Aerospace, and I'd like to thank Margaret and Roger and everyone at the Smithsonian for taking a topic that's been such a passion for me in my life and taking it seriously, because while Star Trek may have not altered the timeline, it has certainly altered my career and I believe the very course of humanity. And what I wanted to, sorry, a little closer to the mic. If I get the PowerPoint presentation up, just tell you a little bit about kind of where Star Trek has interacted with my life and how it has influenced some of our company's development and that of the space sector as a whole. There we go. So as you can see, this is a mock-up of an Orion Light spacecraft that our engineers were having a little fun with. Apparently they didn't get the memo on the A, B, C, and D and just went with NCC 1702, but hey, nobody's perfect. So to make a very long story short, Bigelow Aerospace was established by the wealthy entrepreneur Robert Bigelow with the exclusive goal of developing expandable space habitat technology. These expandable habitats will form the backbone of the next generation of living quarters and really spaceships for where astronauts will live and work. The advantages of these systems are many and numerous. You get a lot more volume with an expandable habitat. It's almost a tent-like concept where it's compacted, so you take up less space in the rocket fairing, it hits orbit, and expands out. The system's also a lot lighter, and believe it or not, because everyone wants to think it's a balloon, these systems are much safer from physical debris. I ask you, if you were about to get hit by a bullet, would you rather have some aluminum in front of you or a Kevlar bulletproof vest? I'm going with the Kevlar bulletproof vest. But possibly most important of all, these systems also provide enhanced protection from radiation. When you're in a metallic structure, such as the International Space Station today, and get hit by solar flares, cosmic rays, you get a nasty secondary radiation effect or scattering effect where the radiation can be almost more dangerous inside the spacecraft than it is outside because the metal gets excited. With expandable habitats, which are basically non-metallic soft goods, you substantially reduce that effect. And I should say, possibly most important of all, in today's fiscally constrained environment, these systems can be constructed for about 1/10 of the cost of a traditional system, so very important. However, this technology had never been demonstrated. NASA originally developed it to go to Mars, but they hadn't really got much past the PowerPoint stage. So we at Bigelow Aerospace and Mr. Bigelow invested his own money to bring this technology to fruition. And the first step was to launch a series of subscale technology demonstrators to prove and validate that this system could even work. And when I say subscale, these weren't small spacecraft by any stretch of the imagination. Genesis 1 was about 10 feet in length, 6 feet in diameter, and tipped the scales about 2,600 pounds. Genesis 2 was closer to 3,000 pounds, 10 feet in length, 8 feet in diameter. And where we started to get Star Trek involved was who was launching Genesis 1 and 2. We contracted with an entity called ISC Kosmotros, a joint Russian-Ukrainian company taking the SS-18, an old Soviet ICBM designated Satan by NATO, removing the nuclear warhead, putting on a commercial fairing, and using this rocket for commercial space launch. Literally a swords into plowshares program. And I can guarantee you the price was right because the rocket had already been built. We just had to take the warhead off, put on a commercial fairing, and we were good to go. And where things got really surreal, as if this wasn't amazing enough, the Russians came to us and said, how would you like to launch from the Yasny Space and Missile Complex? My next question, what the hell is the Yasny Space and Missile Complex? Those of you know, where do the Russians usually launch from? Where do our astronauts go from the ISS? Where is it in Russia? Kazakhstan, Baikonur, exactly. Turns out Yasny is an active Russian nuclear missile base in Siberia. So I will never complain about the weather in Russia, having gone back and forth for 3 to 4 years in that area. And what I'm going to show you is a little video taken by CNBC about the Genesis 2 launch in Yasny. Well, before I get to that, so reality into art. All right. Star Trek First Contact. How did we deploy the first warp ship? Converted ICBM. How was Genesis 1 and 2 launched? Converted ICBM. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. Here on the left side, this is a picture from Star Trek First Contact of the American ICBM. To your right is a picture of Genesis 1 being deployed by the Russian ICBM. Where did it launch from in First Contact? What state? Montana. We launched from Russia, but I'm from Montana. And so are my parents who are in the audiences today. Mom and Papa Golder just turned 40 yesterday. So now let's get to the video.
To pursue his dream, Bigelow had to travel to the most unlikely place, thousands of miles from his Las Vegas home. It's an area never photographed or visited by Western media until now. This is Russia's Yasny military base, located near the Kazakhstan border. Yasny was ground zero during the Cold War, a Soviet missile facility designed to bring mass destruction to the U.S.
Well, I can remember when all these missiles, were feared in the 1950s. We didn't know from moment to moment sometimes because of the rhetoric that was going on from Washington and Moscow as to, it was during the time when everybody had bunkers, they had the bomb shelters.
Yasny is still a military base, but it's now home to the Russian aerospace company Kosmotros. Old enemies now partnering up.
But here we are at a military base, and they're actually hosting us and launching our spacecraft.
Bigelow has come here to conduct a critically important test launch intended to prove his prototype, Genesis 2, can actually work. He eventually hopes to deploy several inflatable structures like this, 50 feet long, 22 feet in diameter, big enough for a team of 10 people to spend days or even months floating in zero gravity.
These vessels are probably the wave of the future.
As opposed to science fiction, what I'm about to show you is the actual launch of Genesis 2, which took place from Siberia in Russia, converted Russian nuclear missile, on June 28th, 2007.
There it goes.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Wow.
Awful.
Oh my God.
That's great. That's great.
I'd like to say at Bigelow Aerospace, reducing the world's nuclear arsenal,
Yeah.
one rocket at a time.
Oh, there it goes.
There it goes.
Congratulations.
It's going to be just about reaching speed of
Speed of
sound now.
sound.
There it goes.
Go, baby, go.
And by the way, for anyone who's watching really closely, this missile is launched by pressurized air from the silo, and only then does it ignite. So let me tell you, that's a scary couple of seconds while that sucker's hanging there before the engine actually turns on. Just to give you a taste of what Genesis 1 and 2 look like in orbit, basically cylindrical in shape. Again, 10 feet in length. This is a shot of Genesis 1. That's actually Namibia in the background. And of course, one of the focuses of the Genesis 1 mission was to prove, first of all, that we could survive the launch environment and that the envelope and superstructure would hold. And I'm proud to say that our engineers estimate that the leak rate was basically in the noise with Genesis 1 and 2, and that these spacecraft can stay fully pressurized and rigidized for, and again, we're just guessing, over 100 years. So you will die of natural causes before you have to worry about pressurization with expandable space habitats. Now, again, literally from Star Trek to reality with a Russian converted nuclear missile, taking these weapons of war, turning them into tools for peaceful commerce. And as a lifelong Star Trek fan, with the parallels so close, I couldn't resist. This is Joint Operations Day at Yasny, and this is myself and our Russian translator next to us. To the left of me is Stanislav Us, one of the last people to win the Order of Lenin Award, and my good friend Vladislav Solovey. And Star Trek had always taught us, via the parallels with the Klingons, that people are people, that your enemies can become your friends, and that there's a future. I mean, I grew up as the child of a Cold War, terrified that my life and that of my family, that of my country, would be ended by nuclear holocaust and the Soviet threat. Star Trek gave us the hope to believe that there was a better future, that there was a better way. And by God, as an adult, I was sitting here on a Russian nuclear missile base, taking those same weapons that I dreaded and using them to push the boundaries of commercial space transportation. And had a few surprises along the way. After the successful launch of Genesis 2, I arrived back from Moscow to Washington late Thursday night. Friday morning, my wife was feeling a little sick, went to the doctor, found out she was pregnant. 9 months later, we had this little guy. And so proud, he wasn't even 12 hours old in this photo, and I was emailing out to all my friends, including the Russians, and they sent me back this shot. It's Photoshop, But they did such a good job that my father-in-law came bursting into the hospital room saying, "How can you put my grandson in a metal collar? He's going to break his neck." And my friends at NASA, they were appalled at how could the Russians put children into space, babies? What kind of animals are we dealing with at Roscosmos? So if anyone from JSC is listening, it was just a joke. I, of course, did nothing to dissuade them that it wasn't the truth. So Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 were in orbit by the fall of 2007. We've now moved on to other programs, and this is a tip of the hat to Star Trek, at least in terms of nomenclature, the beam, the Bigelow Expandable Activity Module. Slightly larger than Genesis 1 and 2, this module is designed and will go to the International Space Station. The habitat will test and demonstrate expandable habitat technology for the first time on a crewed system. It will be launched in the summer of 2015 on a Falcon 9 rocket developed by SpaceX, and at some point that year, the first astronaut on the ISS will step inside an expandable habitat for the very first time. And we're really excited about the collaboration with NASA and the work on the ISS and where this program will lead. And NASA made up a quick little video to show you how exactly that's going to happen. See if it works. So again, the beam will be launched in what's called the trunk of the Dragon capsule. The robotic arm, the Canadarm, will remove the beam from the Dragon capsule, take it over to the aft port of Node 3, where the beam will be attached to the ISS. And this is my favorite part. Got to watch closely. Wait for it. Wait for it. And oh, the magic happens. Look at that, it expanded. I had thought that process would take hours. I'm glad to see that it occurred perfectly and instantly in the NASA animation. So let's hope it works out. Moving forward, and you saw a little of this in the previous video, we're developing the BA 330. The name, as the name indicates, 330 cubic meters of usable volume. Each of these modules can support a crew of 6, equaling that of the International Space Station. And they can function as an independent space station or spacecraft, or we can gang them together, as you see in this picture here. Now, we've got plans for operations in low Earth orbit to support both public and private enterprises, but also we would like to see these habitats go back to their original purpose, which is to carry astronauts beyond low Earth orbit to destinations such as the moon. And here you see that not only our habitats can be used for space activities in terms of transportation and getting to different destinations, but can also be used on celestial surfaces. And this is an example of the BA 330s there on the moon. So, bottom line, if I can leave you with anything, it's that don't just sit there on the couch or in the theater enjoying Star Trek, wishing that it was real. Take your dreams, get up, and make them reality. It doesn't have to remain fantasy. And if you're truly a fan, fandom means more than watching. It means trying to achieve what it is we love so much. Because I can assure you, you can do anything. I sat on a Russian nuclear missile base, launching expandable habitats, built in Las Vegas, on a converted Russian nuclear missile, and had it work twice. Nothing is impossible.
Thank you very much. I want to thank all of our panelists, Mike Gold, Nancy Reagin, Dan Hendrickson, and our audience today. We will take a few questions if people have them. We've got a microphone up there so that everyone can hear you. And I'm just really pleased because I really felt like in this gallery, especially in Moving Beyond Earth, we're telling the story of the space shuttle, the International Space Station, and future human spaceflight, and trying to put that in some historical context. And I really feel like all of the talks today added to what we're doing in this gallery.
Hi, Bill Off at Bethesda. Who's responsible for Star Trek and things like it losing their sense of humor? In the beginning, it was a pretty funny show. Bones and the Scotty and the stoic Vulcan, and even the costumes on the female members were pretty funny at times. But it's not funny now. Can you imagine Abrams dealing with Trekkies and Tribbles?
I think the reboot has brought some of that humor back, and I'm hearing from folks who have seen the new movie that there are some very nice moments in there. For full disclosure, I don't think anyone on the stage has seen the new. You have seen it, but Nancy and I have not, and we don't want to know. So no, don't tell us. No spoilers, please. But I think that they have been trying to bring some of the humor back to it, and have some fun with it, and some of that campy feel that was so fun with the original series, especially.
Hi, I'm Kathleen Mullins. The new one is very funny. There was a lot of laughs in the theater, and there's a lot of hat tips to the old series, which for a lot of us who are fans was good to see. I actually am really concerned about seeing more women in the depictions we see, but also in the realities. How can we get more girls excited and into this? Women have great ideas. How do we get them excited and moving those forward and into the field? And not that you guys haven't done a great job. Love the space flight, love the space station. But I'd like to know, how can we get more women and girls engaged in it?
Well, the most important thing is to have some good examples to begin with. And we have one of them in the audience right now. Patty Gray Smith. Patty, give us a wave. This is the former administrator of the FAA's Office of Commercial Space Transportation for 11 years, and she's here fresh from testifying on Capitol Hill. But I'll tell you, it's a problem, because when we're in meetings in the aerospace industry, I mean, it looks like Augusta Golf Club from 1956. All right, we got real problems in terms of diversity. And frankly, I think that the lack of diversity is sometimes why we haven't seen the progress that we need to see in the space industry. But the good news is, I think particularly as we look at more commercial activities, some of the next generation companies such as myself, SpaceX, et cetera, and frankly, many of the efforts of traditional companies such as Boeing and Lockheed, they're promoting more women, getting more women involved. My mother works as a NASA Hunch program where they're trying to get students in high school building technology and systems that will be used by NASA, even experiments flown in zero-G in the ISS. So we have to have aggressive outreach in STEM to women and give them some examples to follow. Another prominent example is Gwynne Shotwell, the president of SpaceX. Women in Aerospace does a great job, and of course I shouldn't leave out Lori Garver, the deputy administrator of NASA. So your number 2 person at NASA is a woman. We need to do more of that.
Well, actually, I think this has been a concern for quite a while, and Margaret wrote a chapter in the Star Trek in History about how Nichelle Nichols actually spent a good deal of time and effort after the first series ended recruiting women and minority mission specialists and astronauts. So it's been, I think, a concern that's been going on for now more than 40 years. And the thing is, people tend to assume that the sheer passage of time will make things better. Of course, it was all worse in the past, right? And now it's better. Just the passage of time, things will get better. And I think if you're a historian, you're aware that that's not so, and that if you want to have attention to diversity or some other desirable goal, it's something that has to be mindfully worked on and recreated in each generation. You know, because with the success that Nichelle Nichols had recruiting women and minority mission specialists 30 years ago, you would think that problem had been solved. But no, it's an ongoing issue because these things are not solvable or fixable that quickly, I'm afraid.
I would just note, I'm not the professional in my organization that works that issue on a regular basis, but the workforce professional who does work STEM issues and work making sure that we have a next generation ready. That's one of the top issues that is always on the top of her agenda. It's really great to see, not only when they have a meeting, but that's the main thrust of what it is they're trying to achieve. So they're always looking at that issue and talking about practical programs that the companies can employ because it's absolutely on the front of their mind. And maybe more strategically to the point, I would also mention that it's always good to identify where it is that we lose school children in this field. It really is crucial that we reach out to them at a very young age. They A, need to be inspired, and B, they need to have the confidence that they know they can work in these fields because it gets challenging really quickly, and they just need to have that self-confidence because we know they have the ability. We know they have the competency, the brilliance to do it, And so I would encourage you, and I would encourage everyone here who is excited by these programs to reach out to children, particularly under the age of 3rd grade and younger, because they found clinically through studies that that's right around the area where you start to lose children to other fields where they decide, I can't do this math or I can't do this science, when we know they can and we know they should.
Thank you.
Hi, how you doing? My name's Shepard Johnson. I'm from Louisa County, Virginia. And I was wondering, this question is for anybody, if you could speak to the relationship between NASA and the Star Trek franchise. For instance, the one of the clips that she showed on the episode called Assignment Earth, they used NASA stock footage. On Star Trek Next Generation, there was, I believe there was an astronaut that appeared in an episode of that, and Star Trek Enterprise, there was also a couple of astronauts in some episodes of that. So if anyone could just speak the relationship between NASA and Star Trek franchise.
I'm not aware of any formal relationship, but I know that the writers and producers of Star Trek have always been fans of NASA, and many folks who work at NASA have been big fans of Star Trek because it's a visualization of the things and the places that they would like to be. And so, yes, Dr. Mae Jemison, who is the first African-American woman astronaut, credits directly Nichelle Nichols and her recruiting campaign from 1977 with persuading her to apply to be an astronaut, to be a mission specialist, and she then later appeared in an episode of one of the Star Trek franchises. And there have been astronauts who appeared on Enterprise, and so the Star Trek producers have always enjoyed the ability to connect with actual spaceflight, and I know that folks who work at NASA in many fields are often fans of space science fiction because they love space and they love these ideas, and I know that Mike Gold wants to tell the story of what a big fan he has been.
I mean, yeah, I personally was inspired by Star Trek, and I don't want to give a percentage, but there's a whole lot of people in the industry at NASA that are there because of Star Trek and what it meant. Star Trek the motion picture, Voyager, right? That was Voyager 6. There were explicit references to NASA. And of course, and the historian probably better speak to this, but the original Enterprise shuttle, of course, was not named after Enterprise the ship. It was named after Enterprise the starship. As a matter of fact, when the calls went out to get the original crew of the Enterprise together, they were disappointed when they found out it was for the space shuttle. They thought it was going to be the announcement of a new Star Trek series. So there has always been an inextricable link between Star Trek and NASA.
I don't have anything to add. He's great.
All right. My name's Chris Harlow. I'm from Rockland, Maine. One of the things with aviation, back in the 50s, it was a dream for everybody to have their own personal aviation experience, whether it be a helicopter in their carport or plane or something like that. And I'm a member of a flying club that unfortunately is, as you say, dying out. Most of the members are in their 50s, 60s, going on up. It's hard to get younger members. Financially, that's been an issue. Is there anything you folks can foresee, or any way you guys are trying to get the cost of new life into the space program?
Or do you?
Okay. Well, that's what the commercial space revolution is all about. This isn't necessarily new technology, but it is dramatically new costs. And in some instances, it's a lot of both. If you look at what's been spent on the commercial space program as a whole, we're talking about $600 million, which sounds like a lot of money to you and I, but is a drop in the bucket relative to what's spent traditionally on these systems. For example, we spend $3 billion a year on developing the traditionally contracted Space Launch System and Orion spacecraft. So you're literally talking about a difference of a factor of 10, nearly, from the new systems to the old. And frankly, it's all about the dollars. What's the old saying? No bucks, no Buck Rogers. And the new systems, by bringing those costs down, will open up space to new nations, a new group of people, and a new generation. It's that price point that's really the most important thing. And in terms of your personal experience, and there's so many examples of Star Trek interacting with space, I forget many of them, but a great one is Virgin Galactic, the VSS Enterprise. I mean, it's named after the Enterprise. And there, you and the general public will have an opportunity for $200,000, $250,000 now, which I know is a little steep, certainly more than getting into the museum, but that price is going to come down. That's a hugely important first step. So you're absolutely right to bring up costs, and the next generation technology isn't just enhancing capabilities like we are with expandable habitats, but in tandem with that, we're bringing down costs, and that's the best of both worlds. New capabilities with lower costs is exactly where we're headed.
Thank you very much.
Well, I would say that the mission of the National Air and Space Museum is to educate, to commemorate, and to inspire. And as we are, and one of the, in this gallery, I think we're really in a place where we're trying to tell those stories about where have we been in space, where are we now, and where are we going. And again, always to put it in that broader historical context and to give it, our public, some insights into what we know about that history and that context. So I'm really delighted with today's panel. I hope that you enjoyed. I hope that you were educated. I hope we were able to inspire a bit. And I thank again our panelists, Mike Gold, Nancy Reagin, and Dan Hendrickson, and I'm Margaret Weitekamp from the National Air and Space Museum. Thank you for your time.